The Living Your Best Life Experiment, Week 34, Chapter 9, Them. So this week's chapter is about the second saboteur, them, and what your conclusions are about other people. And I like to call this one your social conclusions. What social conclusions have you come to? So it started out with saying that these conclusions about who people are really about who they are to you, not who they actually are or who they could be, but how they've interacted in your life along the way. And it really starts to look at separating the events around those people or contributing things to those people, as opposed to just looking at the things that have happened objectively as these things happened. And he says that you're not a victim until the moment you decide that you are. And it goes on to say that this isn't about blame or about who is to blame, but rather to empower you to move past the power that you've given to these people that you've attributed your downfall to, I guess. And that your conclusions are a perfect mode for survival, safety, and security. So what I got from that is that he's saying that in our minds we contribute certain characteristics to these people, and our mind will really go back and focus on those certain characteristics when we come across them in other people, and that is part of our makeup for survival. Then it goes on to say that, because of this mechanism, we tend to focus a lot on events that don't need to be survived. Things like making an appointment with the doctor, or standing in line at the grocery store, or being concerned that people are talking about you when you walk into a restaurant by yourself. Stuff like that. But because we're programmed for survival and we've had all these events and interactions with people, they've contributed to those conclusions that we make. And that a lot of times it only takes one or two of these conclusions to get ingrained in our makeup and become the basis of how we view other people. And then he says that whatever you resist exists by that resistance. So the more that you resist these conclusions that you've come to because of the things that have happened in the past or present or will happen, that they exist by your resistance against them. So your conclusions exist by your resistance against them. And he says that the conclusions that we come to can sometimes be caused by the most simple mundane things. Mundane things. But once it's ingrained in us, that it takes a major realization before you can actually address it. So you actually need to figure out what it is before you can address it. And that we view everyone through this lens, and we change how we act to best suit it. So he's saying that we always have these conclusions, and that we view people in the world through these conclusions, and that we always alter ourselves in the best way to protect ourselves from these conclusions, and that we hold ourselves back so that we can see what conclusion they fit into. So we don't give ourselves fully until we know where they sit on our scale of conclusions. And that your pass or fail mechanism is always on. So you're always subconsciously registering whether this person passes your conclusions or if they fail them. And that once your radar is set off that this person has failed in one of your conclusions, that we then look for further validation to support our reasoning for that conclusion and that person failed it. And once that they've failed, you put them into a box and you segregate them from you. So once you decided that this person isn't going to be good for me, or I've been down this path before, then you put them in a box and you segregate them. And that by segregating people, we only develop surface interactions. So once I got to this part, it kind of started making a little bit more sense. I have to admit I was a little bit unsure what he was trying to say. But then once I got to this part, it really kind of hit home, because I do this a lot with people. And then he goes on to talk about how we write people off and how it varies. Sometimes we do it slowly, and other times we just do it quickly and sever all ties. But eventually, when you segregate those people and hold them at arm's length, eventually you do end up writing them off. And he says the problem with that is that now you're only seeing them through the lens of your conclusion and not for who they actually are or who they could be. And as part of that, when you go to get validation from other people that they are the worst or whatever, a lot of times that tends to lead to gossip. And that gossip is a distraction from changing and owning your own life. And then it kind of goes on a tangent about being a decent human being and being kind and talking in a way that makes things happen rather than shredding people apart and creating those shallow interactions. And he says that yes, people do shitty things, but this is not about them. It's about you and how you interact in this world. And that when we hold on to those resentments, that it only weighs us down. I always like to think of that old proverb that forgiveness isn't for them, it's for yourself. And over the years, I've found that to be very true. So it's at this point in this chapter where I got distracted from the stone wall and the pictures that I seen in them. But as I was sketching this, I really thought about the interactions in my life and how this year was actually my mission to become more transparent with myself instead of holding myself back from people. So the next part goes on to say, ask you, well, how do you deal with it? You don't put up with other people's BS. You be clear and upfront with what you want. And if it's not something that they want or don't want to engage with you, then that's up to them, and not to sweat it, because in the long term it doesn't really matter. And then again, I got distracted and drew another sketch. But I think that is probably a problem that a lot of people face, is being upfront with people and really stating what you want. And I'm guessing part of that would be a fear of rejection, that they don't want what you want. And it goes on to say that when people do things to us, that us as humans are not meant to change how we are. And when we do that, we end up holding on to resentments, and we end up stifling our outlets for love and joy. So basically, when we find ourselves altering how we behave because of the things that other people have done towards us, we block off our receptors for love and joy. And then he really goes on to emphasize it again about how you need to work out how to be kind, but not being a doormat. So trying to find that balance of being a good human without letting people take advantage of you. And then he talks about how we need to interact with people in a non-judgmental way, because we've all been in the position where we could be judged. But if you take a look at yourself in those times where you've been in a position to be judged, that moment in time doesn't define you as an overall person. And again, I'm a horribly distracted person, and all I hear when I read that, "Welcome to the jungle," is Axl Rose. And now we ended up meeting this very wrinkly Count Chocula kind of looking guy who came to reinforce that you need to be non-judgmental and a kind person, because even though he looks like he might want to suck your blood, he might be a vegetarian. You just never know. So maybe just talk to him. Then we talk about how we're programmed to look at the positive of our own traits, but we fail to see the flip sides. So as we're going on in our day-to-day, say like me, for example, I'm a very independent person, and we would be naturally programmed to look at the positives of being an independent person, but rarely do we ever look at the bad side of that trait. And he talks about how a lot of our conclusions can be found in those things that we think overly positive about. He also says to look at the excuses you make, and when the sun feels like it will burn you. I have no idea what that meant. When the sun feels like it will burn you. Clearly you're a vampire. I actually had to go back and read that part, and it was just alluding to when, friends ask you to go out and do something, and it feels like the equivalent of sun to a vampire. So then he tells us to look at the labels that we place on people and why exactly we've placed those labels on those people. And then he tells us to be honest with ourselves and ask ourselves what we're trying to avoid and answer the question, people are what? People are stupid, untrustworthy, threat, unreliable, uncaring, selfish, cruel. Be really honest with yourself and answer that question of what you think people are in general, a generalized. So my social conclusion ended up being that people are scary or fucked, to be blunt. And what does that actually mean, though? Like, what does that mean to me? So, in my mind, it's a scary thought of how people can be so unpredictable and cruel, not only physically, but emotionally. And the events that have happened through my life have really caused a hypersensitivity to my surroundings and what people are doing within those surroundings. And I think on the negative side, I do find when I first meet people that I am very held back and that I don't open up as a person until I feel comfortable in a situation. But also on the flip side, on the positive side, that aspect of my own personality has really contributed to my survival. So there's a part of me that really doesn't like that aspect of it, because I do tend to make a lot of superficial connections because of it. But also there's the other side that is thankful that it's part of my personality, because it has really carried me through a lot of situations where I feel if it wasn't a part of my personality, that I probably wouldn't be here, to be frank. So it's very hard for me to let that aspect go. But part of my journey towards healing Being a more open person, I have found letting go of those resentments and anger and taking back the power that I was giving to other people really helped me feel like I could open up. And, compared to like 10 or 15 years ago, I'm a lot more open with people than I used to be. But that's only the surface. So once people get past that point, to the point where I could have a more in-depth relationship with them, I found for a lot of years I was very bad at compartmentalizing people or putting them in their own boxes and only allowing them to see the parts of my life that I felt comfortable with them seeing. And a lot of that stemmed from my unwillingness to create those emotional bonds with people out of fear of losing them. And that stemmed from losing my father at a young age. And after I'd lost him, I completely shut down emotionally. I didn't cry until my mother passed away 10 years later. So you see, once you start really looking at your reasoning behind things and how you view other people, you really lead yourself down your own little rabbit hole. And you really need to take the time to look at all those aspects and to realize when they're creeping up. And even to this day, I find myself really holding back. And I really have to remind myself of the reasonings why I'm doing that. So why are you holding yourself back? And give myself a little pep talk to work through that. So this chapter was really insightful. Even though me myself, I didn't have those aha moments. I feel like this could lead to some of those aha moments for people. If I had not already been looking at those aspects and working through them over the last, 10 years, then I feel like it definitely would have been beneficial for me to read this. So until next time, bye.